Flamethrowers are some of the most feared weapons ever used in war. They didn't just destroy bunkers and caves, they turned entire battlefields into firestorms and left behind scars that no soldier ever forgot. In this video, we're uncovering the entire dark truth about flamethrowers in World War II. From their origins in ancient warfare to their terrifying role in places like Iwo Jima, we'll explore why they were so effective, why they were so hated, and why even the men who carried them often didn't survive. And by the end, you'll understand why the world eventually decided these weapons had no place in modern combat. Long before World War II, humanity had already discovered the terrifying potential of fire as a weapon. In fact, some of the earliest recorded uses of fire in combat go back to the ancient world. The Byzantines perfected something called Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary liquid launched from siphons on ships during naval battles. Ancient sources describe it as a substance that stuck to surfaces, clung to ships, and could not be extinguished with water. To enemies, it seemed like supernatural fire, a divine punishment hurled from the heavens. Its secret formula was so closely guarded that it was eventually lost to history, but its impact was unforgettable. The fear of fire was now part of the battlefield. Fast forward to the Industrial Age, and fire once again emerged as a weapon of war. In World War I, technology gave fire new life. Trench warfare had bogged down the front lines in endless stalemates. Traditional weapons couldn't flush enemy soldiers out of deep dugouts or fortified trench systems. The Germans turned to innovation, and in 1915, they debuted the Flammenwerfer, or flamethrower. The first attacks were devastating. At Hooge in Belgium, German troops unleashed liquid fire that poured across the trenches. Flames filled the narrow earthworks, burning soldiers alive and forcing survivors to flee in blind panic. French officers who witnessed these attacks described them as nightmares made real and hell itself on earth. The effect wasn't just physical destruction, it was psychological terror. Even rumors of a flamethrower attack were enough to spread fear across entire sectors of the front. Though the flamethrower was still primitive, heavy, short-ranged, and often as dangerous to its user as the enemy, it had proven its worth as a weapon of shock and horror. By the end of World War I, all major armies had experimented with some form of flamethrower. They learned two crucial lessons. First, that fire could succeed where bullets and shells failed, and second, that flamethrower operators would always be marked men, carrying not just fuel, but the enemy's hatred on their backs. These lessons, learned in the mud of Flanders and Verdun, set the stage for what would come 2 decades later. When World War II erupted, the flamethrower would return, more advanced, more portable, and infinitely more terrifying. Between the wars, militaries didn't forget what they had seen in the trenches. Engineers and planners studied how to make flamethrowers lighter, deadlier, and more reliable. By the time World War II began in 1939, 2 distinct types of flamethrowers were ready to be unleashed: man-portable flamethrowers carried by infantry, and vehicle-mounted flamethrowers bolted onto tanks and armored vehicles. The man-portable designs usually consisted of a backpack with fuel tanks connected to a hose and nozzle. A small igniter at the tip allowed the operator to send out a stream of flaming liquid up to 30 to 40 yards. These models were terrifyingly effective at close range, but they had drawbacks. The operator carried over 60 to 70 pounds of volatile fuel on his back, making him a slow, obvious target. Snipers learned to pick out flamethrower troops instantly. Many flame operators didn't survive their first battle, either shot before they could fire or blown apart when their tanks exploded. Vehicle-mounted flamethrowers were another story. Tanks like the British Churchill Crocodile towed armored trailers full of fuel and could blast fire over 100 yards, turning bunkers into ovens. The Americans later fielded the Sherman Zippo, while the Japanese and Soviets also experimented with flame tanks. Mounted flamethrowers gave crews protection and terrifying reach, but they were still vulnerable. A hit on the fuel trailer of a crocodile, for example, could ignite a catastrophic fireball. One innovation changed everything: napalm. Developed in 1942 by Harvard scientists, napalm was a thickened gasoline that clung to surfaces and burned longer than raw fuel. With napalm, flamethrowers became exponentially more lethal. Flames stuck to walls, trees, and even enemy soldiers, creating an inescapable inferno. Suddenly, what had been a weapon of short, terrifying bursts in World War I was now a sustained, roaring torrent of fire. By the early 1940s, all major powers had flamethrowers in their arsenals. The Germans refined their Flammenwerfer models. The Soviets produced the Arokes series, cleverly disguising the weapon's nozzle to look like a rifle barrel so operators wouldn't be instantly targeted. The Japanese built their Type 93 and Type 100 flamethrowers, and the Americans pushed the M1 and later M2 into service across the Pacific. World War II was a war of innovation, and few weapons demonstrated the dark creativity of the human mind more than the flamethrower. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological instrument designed to terrify, to flush enemies from hiding, and to send a message: there is nowhere to run from fire. If there was any theater of World War II where the flamethrower became synonymous with sheer brutality, it was the Eastern Front. In the apocalyptic struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, battles were fought street by street, house by house, bunker by bunker. Here, the flamethrower was not just a weapon. It was a tool of survival in urban and close-quarters combat. German pioneer assault engineers carried the Flammenwerfer 35 and later the lighter Flammenwerfer 41. These men were sent forward to clear Soviet bunkers, cellars, and trench systems during the massive offensives into the Soviet Union. In the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, flamethrower operators advanced through rubble-filled streets, spewing sheets of fire into doorways and basements. For defenders huddled in the dark, there was no worse fate. Soviet survivors later recounted the horror of hearing the hiss of pressurized fuel just before flames roared in, consuming everything. But the Soviets were not defenseless. They developed their own flamethrowers, like the Rokas 2 and Rokas 3, which had a unique and deadly trick. To protect their operators from instant execution, Soviet designers disguised the nozzle as the barrel of a standard Mosin Nagant rifle and shaped the fuel tanks to look like backpacks. At a distance, these soldiers blended in with ordinary riflemen. Only when the weapon ignited did the deception become clear. It was a clever design choice born of necessity, because on both sides of the front, flamethrower operators were priority targets. If captured, they were often executed on the spot. Soldiers viewed them as executioners rather than combatants, wielding a weapon that left no chance of a clean death. The Soviets also took firepower to another level by mounting flamethrowers on tanks like the OT-34, a variant of the famous T-34, which carried a flame projector in place of its hull machine gun. These tanks rolled up to German positions and turned pillboxes into infernos in seconds. German reports describe entire defensive lines collapsing after a single flame tank attack, as soldiers abandoned their posts in panic. The Eastern Front was already a theater defined by cruelty, but flamethrowers elevated the psychological terror to unimaginable heights. For defenders, the fear of being burned alive often outweighed even artillery bombardments. For flamethrower operators, it was a short and brutal career. Either you unleashed fire on the enemy, or you were gunned down before you could even squeeze the trigger. In a war remembered for its extremes of human suffering, the flamethrower was both a symbol and a tool of that brutality. While the Eastern Front saw flamethrowers used amid urban rubble and endless trench lines, the Western Front revealed just how much fear these weapons could inspire in German defenders. When the Allies launched the Normandy invasion in June 1944, they faced the nightmare of the Atlantic Wall, a series of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and machine gun nests bristling with firepower. Ordinary rifles and grenades couldn't dig German troops out of such fortifications. Flamethrowers could. On D-Day, U.S. Army and Marine flamethrower teams waded ashore carrying 70-pound tanks of fuel. In the chaos of Omaha and Utah Beach, they inched forward under withering fire, blasting flame into bunker embrasures. One short burst could turn a fortified position silent, either killing the occupants or forcing them to surrender. The spectacle of flame, a liquid tongue of fire curling into a pillbox, broke the will of many German defenders more effectively than any artillery shell. But it was the British Churchill Crocodile that became the ultimate terror weapon in Western Europe. This modified tank replaced its hull-mounted machine gun with a flamethrower nozzle and towed a massive fuel trailer capable of firing over 100 bursts of flame. Its range of more than 100 yards meant that crocodiles could incinerate targets from safety, turning bunkers and trenches into fiery graves. German troops dreaded them. Many accounts describe defenders surrendering at the mere sight of a crocodile rumbling into range. In their eyes, there was no worse fate than to be trapped in a bunker as flames poured inside. The hatred for these tanks ran so deep that captured crocodile crews were often executed immediately by German forces, much like captured snipers. This grim fact shows the moral stain flamethrowers carried on the battlefield. They were effective, yes, but also considered dishonorable by those forced to face them. From Normandy through the liberation of France and into Germany itself, flamethrowers helped Allied forces dismantle one strong point after another. Yet their use carried a psychological cost. Even among Allied troops, flamethrower operators were often isolated, both because they drew enemy fire and because their weapon forced them to deliver deaths that were gruesome to witness. Soldiers would later recall how entire positions went silent after one blast, the enemy either consumed or too terrified to move. The weapon worked, but at a terrible moral price. If Europe showed the effectiveness of flamethrowers against bunkers, the Pacific theater revealed their full, horrifying potential. The island-hopping campaign fought by U.S. Marines and Army troops was defined by brutal, close-quarters combat against Japanese defenders who refused to surrender. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the Japanese built vast underground fortresses of caves, pillboxes, and tunnels, determined to hold out to the last man. For the Americans, standard weapons often couldn't reach these positions. The answer was fire. Japanese forces fielded their own flamethrowers early in the war, such as the Type 93 and Type 100, but their use was limited compared to the Allies. American engineers, on the other hand, carried the M1 and M2 flamethrowers into battle with growing frequency. They also developed specialized flame tanks, nicknamed Zippos, based on Shermans that replaced their main gun with a flame projector. These machines became essential for clearing fortified strongholds. On islands like Peleliu and Saipan, flamethrower teams advanced yard by yard, burning out caves where defenders were dug in with machine guns. The flame wasn't just fire. It consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces, suffocating soldiers deep inside even if they avoided the flames themselves. Survivors later described being driven to madness by the heat, smoke, and terror. Japanese veterans admitted they feared flamethrowers more than any other weapon. Some chose suicide charges rather than face being burned alive. For American operators, however, the role was equally grim. Carrying a 70-pound fuel tank made them slow, obvious targets. Japanese snipers singled them out immediately. Many flamethrower men didn't survive their first day of combat. One Marine recalled, "If you were a flamethrower, you were the first man they went after." Yet, despite the danger, they pressed forward, because without them, caves and bunkers would have cost thousands more lives to take. The Pacific Campaign showed the world a unique kind of hell. Jungles and volcanic rock turned into blazing infernos. The flamethrower became more than just a weapon. It was a psychological hammer that broke the will of defenders and turned the battlefield into something more primal, more terrifying, and more personal than any artillery shell could. Nowhere did flamethrowers define battle more than on Iwo Jima in 1945. This 8-square-mile island was a fortress honeycombed with tunnels and defended by nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers determined to fight to the death. For the Marines who landed there, flamethrowers became the key to survival, and also a death sentence for those carrying them. Operators like Corporal Don Graves remembered stepping ashore with 72 pounds of volatile fuel on their backs into a storm of bullets and artillery. Graves later recalled, "I'm the only flamethrower in 2nd Battalion that came off Iwo. We had 335 Marines going in. 18 came off. That staggering statistic, a 95% casualty rate, illustrates just how dangerous the role was. Flamethrower men were marked targets, hunted relentlessly by Japanese defenders who knew what awaited them if they let one get close. Despite the danger, flamethrowers proved decisive, none more so than in the hands of Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, who became a legend on Iwo Jima. In one day of brutal fighting, Williams made 5 separate runs with flamethrowers and demolition charges, crawling forward under machine gun fire to attack pillboxes that pinned his comrades down. He climbed on top of bunkers, shoved flame nozzles through vents, and incinerated defenders inside. By the end of the day, he had silenced multiple positions single-handedly, earning the Medal of Honor. But for every hero like Williams, dozens of flamethrower operators died before they could even fire. The black volcanic sands and jagged rocks of Iwo Jima became littered with burned bunkers and shattered flamethrower tanks. Marines advanced through areas nicknamed the Meat Grinder and Hell's Pocket, where each foot of ground was won by fire and blood. By the time Iwo Jima was secured after 36 days, nearly every Japanese defender was dead, many consumed in flames. Out of 27 Medals of Honor awarded during the battle, 12 were given to men who destroyed positions with flamethrowers or explosives, though only half survived to receive them. Iwo Jima became the ultimate symbol of the flamethrower's terrible effectiveness. A weapon that could win battles, but at the cost of the men who carried it. The flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was a nightmare that crawled into the minds of everyone who saw it. To the soldiers on the receiving end, it embodied one of the most primal fears: being burned alive. Unlike bullets or shells, which killed quickly and often unseen, the flamethrower was brutally personal. You could see the fire coming. You could feel the heat before it even reached you. And when it struck, there was no escape. Japanese veterans later admitted they feared flamethrowers above all other weapons. The detonation of a grenade might end life instantly, but the whoosh of flame meant agony, suffocation, and certain death. Bunkers often went silent after a single blast, not because everyone inside was killed, but because panic had already broken their will to fight. Some Japanese soldiers, rather than endure the flames, chose suicide charges or grenades against their own bodies. Fire, more than bullets, forced the mind into despair. But the horror wasn't only felt by the enemy. Flamethrower operators themselves carried scars that no metal could erase. Imagine shouldering 70 pounds of fuel, knowing that every enemy sniper was searching for you first. Imagine pressing the trigger, hearing screams erupt from a bunker you've just engulfed. Many veterans later admitted that the memories of using flamethrowers haunted them more than anything else they experienced in battle. Some described nightmares where they still heard those screams decades later. Others avoided talking about their service at all, unable to reconcile their actions with their conscience. On the battlefield, flamethrower troops were often isolated even within their own units. Fellow soldiers respected them, but also kept their distance. Not just because the tanks on their backs could explode, but because of the grim, almost cursed role they played. In both Europe and the Pacific, captured flamethrower operators were sometimes executed immediately. German soldiers saw them as wielders of an inhuman weapon, unworthy of mercy. The Soviets disguised their flamethrowers to look like rifles precisely because they knew snipers would target them above all others. This was the psychological truth of the flamethrower. It was not just a tool of destruction, but a weapon of fear. It destroyed morale as much as it destroyed fortifications. It scarred those who used it, and it terrorized those who faced it. Long after the flames burned out, the memories continued to smolder. When World War II ended in 1945, the world confronted not just the wreckage of cities and armies, but also the moral wreckage of the weapons that had been used. Among them, flamethrowers stood out. Images of scorched bodies, burned bunkers, and charred landscapes shocked civilians who had been shielded from the realities of battle. The flamethrower was technically legal under the laws of war. The Geneva Conventions had not explicitly banned it. But in the eyes of many, it crossed a line into barbarity. The weapon remained in service after 1945. It was used in Korea and most infamously in Vietnam, where napalm turned entire villages into infernos. The sight of children running from firebombs sparked outrage worldwide, and flamethrowers themselves became symbols of cruelty. Protesters in the 1960s carried signs condemning the use of fire weapons as crimes against humanity. Public opinion was turning, and militaries began to take notice. By the late 1970s, flamethrowers were disappearing from arsenals. The U.S. Department of Defense officially retired its flamethrowers in 1978, citing their limited tactical usefulness and the horrific image they projected. Other nations quietly followed suit. In 1980, the world community came together to pass Protocol 3 of the UN Convention on certain conventional weapons, which banned the use of incendiary weapons like flamethrowers against civilian populations and restricted their use even against military targets in populated areas. While not an outright prohibition, it was an acknowledgement that fire as a weapon inflicted suffering beyond the pale. Today, flamethrowers are largely relics of the past, preserved in museums or displayed at military reenactments. They survive more as symbols than as tools, reminders of an era when war blurred the line between necessity and cruelty. Yet the debate lingers. Were flamethrowers justified in battles like Iwo Jima, where they saved thousands of Allied lives by silencing fortifications quickly? Or did they represent the darkest side of human ingenuity? A descent into fear and suffering that no cause could ever justify? The world chose to phase them out, but the shadow they left remains. The flamethrower was not just another weapon of World War II. It was a moral dilemma made of fire, one that forced humanity to look at itself in the mirror of its own cruelty.
At 6:45 on February 21st, 1945, Sergeant Robert Ronson watched his M4A 3R3 Sherman flame tank idle at the edge of Iwo Jima's 3rd airfield. The tank carried 290 gallons of napalm fuel. The main gun had been replaced with an E-4-5 flamethrower capable of projecting ignited fuel 150 yards. Maximum burn time, 90 seconds. The Japanese had fortified every cave, every bunker, every pillbox on the island with reinforced concrete and interconnected tunnels. Artillery couldn't reach them. Infantry couldn't dig them out. Standard tanks couldn't suppress them. Ronson's flame tank could burn them out. If the crew survived long enough to get in range. If you want deep cinematic World War II history like this, subscribe to No Man's Land, because this is where the real story of the war is told. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand, defended by 21,000 Japanese troops. The island sat 660 miles south of Tokyo. 3 airfields provided emergency landing sites for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan. American forces needed those airfields. Japanese forces would defend them to the death. The invasion began on February 19, 1945. The Marines expected to secure the island in 5 days. The battle would last 36 days and kill 26,000 men. The problem was fortifications. Japanese commander Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months turning Iwo Jima into a fortress. His forces dug 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions. Pillboxes were constructed from reinforced concrete 3 feet thick. Bunkers were buried under 30 feet of volcanic rock. Gun emplacements were designed with overlapping fields of fire. Every position could support adjacent positions. Every approach was covered by multiple weapons. The defensive network was the most sophisticated the Americans had faced in the Pacific. Standard tactics were ineffective. Naval gunfire could crater the surface but couldn't penetrate the deep bunkers. Aerial bombardment destroyed above-ground structures but left underground positions intact. Artillery suppressed defensive fire temporarily but couldn't eliminate fortified positions. Infantry assaults resulted in massive casualties. Marines would advance across open ground under heavy fire, reach a pillbox, throw grenades inside, and watch the grenades bounce back out. The firing ports were designed to deflect grenades. The defenders were protected. The attackers were exposed. Tank support helped, but had limitations. Standard M4 Sherman tanks carried 75mm main guns effective against light fortifications. Against reinforced concrete, the 75mm shells created craters but rarely penetrated. Against pillboxes with 3-foot thick walls, the shells were ineffective. Tanks could provide suppressive fire while infantry maneuvered, but they couldn't destroy the bunkers that killed the most Marines. The Marine Corps had anticipated this problem. In 1943, chemical warfare specialists at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, began developing a tank-mounted flame weapon. The concept was simple. Replace the tank's main gun with a flamethrower. Use the tank's armor to protect the crew while approaching fortified positions. Project ignited fuel into bunkers, pillboxes, and caves. Burn out defenders that conventional weapons couldn't reach. The weapon would be devastating if it worked. The first prototype was designated E1, a modified M3 medium tank with a flame gun mounted in the turret. The system used compressed air to project fuel. Range was 40 yards. Burn time was 30 seconds. Testing in 1943 revealed multiple problems. The compressed air system was unreliable. The range was too short. The fuel consumption was excessive. The E1 was abandoned. The second prototype was designated E2. This system used the tank's engine to power a fuel pump. Pressure increased. Range increased to 80 yards. Burn time increased to 60 seconds. Testing in early 1944 showed improvement, but the system remained problematic. The fuel pump was mechanically complex. Field maintenance was difficult. Reliability was poor. The E2 was redesigned. The third prototype was designated E4-5. This system used a different approach. Instead of pumping fuel under pressure, the E4-5 used the tank's auxiliary engine to drive a centrifugal pump. The pump created consistent pressure. The fuel was a mixture of gasoline, diesel, and napalm thickening agent. The napalm made the fuel sticky. It would adhere to surfaces and burn longer. The ignition system used an electrical arc rather than a pilot light. More reliable, less prone to failure. The E4-5 flamethrower could project ignited napalm 150 yards in still air. Wind reduced range. The fuel tank held 290 gallons. Total burn time was 90 seconds of continuous firing. In practice, operators fired in short bursts, 2 to 5 seconds per burst. This extended operational time to approximately 60 bursts, enough to engage multiple targets before requiring refueling. The flamethrower replaced the Sherman tank's 75mm main gun. The flame gun was installed in the gun mount. From a distance, the tank looked like a standard Sherman. Only the absence of a muzzle brake indicated something different. This was deliberate. Japanese forces concentrated anti-tank fire on specialized vehicles. A flame tank that looked like a standard tank might survive longer. The tank retained its bow-mounted .30 caliber machine gun and turret-mounted .50 caliber machine gun. Defensive armament remained standard. The crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. The loader's job changed from handling shells to monitoring fuel pressure and flame gun operation. Technical training took 4 weeks. Combat training took another 6 weeks. The Marine Corps ordered 54 flame tanks in August 1944. Designated M4A3R3 Sherman Zippo. The unofficial nickname came from the Zippo lighter. Both produced flame. Both were reliable. Both were American-made. The name stuck. The tanks were manufactured at the Fisher Body Division of General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan. Production began in September 1944. The first 8 tanks shipped to the Pacific in November. Destination: Iwo Jima. Sergeant Robert Ronson joined the Marine Corps in 1942. Tank training at Camp Pendleton, California. Sherman Tank Mechanic Course. Tank Gunnery School. He deployed to the Pacific in early 1943 with the 4th Tank Battalion. Saw action at Roy Namur, Saipan, and Tinian. Promoted to sergeant in July 1944. When the Marine Corps formed flame tank platoons, Ronson volunteered. He transferred to the 5th Tank Battalion's C Company. 4 flame tanks, 20 crew members. Mission: support infantry assaults on fortified positions. The flame tanks arrived at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, D-Day. The tanks were loaded aboard LSTs and transported to the beach with standard Sherman tanks. Japanese artillery fire was intense. 2 LSTs were hit before reaching the shore. One flame tank was destroyed on the beach by a 47mm anti-tank gun. The remaining 7 tanks made it inland. They were assigned to support the 5th Marine Division's assault on the southern portion of the island. Ronson's tank was designated C-21, standard M4A3 Sherman chassis, E4-5 flamethrower replacing the main gun. 290 gallons of napalm fuel in armored tanks mounted inside the hull. The fuel tanks were supposed to be safer than external mounting. A penetrating hit would rupture the tank and ignite the fuel. The crew would burn to death inside the tank. Ronson tried not to think about it. The first combat use of flame tanks on Iwo Jima occurred on February 20th, 1945. D-Day +1. The 5th Marine Division was advancing toward the base of Mount Suribachi. Japanese forces occupied dozens of bunkers and pillboxes blocking the advance. Standard tanks and artillery had failed to eliminate the positions. Infantry casualties were mounting. The division commander ordered flame tanks forward. C-21 approached a concrete pillbox at 0830 hours. The pillbox was built into a hillside. 3 feet of reinforced concrete. Firing ports covering the approach route. A 75mm mountain gun inside. The gun had destroyed 2 American tanks that morning. Infantry could not approach. Artillery had hit the position repeatedly. The concrete was cracked but intact. The defenders were still firing. Ronson positioned C-21 200 yards from the pillbox, beyond effective range of the Japanese mountain gun. The tank's armor could withstand 47mm anti-tank guns at that distance. Probably. The 75mm mountain gun was different. A direct hit would penetrate. Ronson ordered the driver forward. The tank advanced at 5 miles per hour. The Japanese gun fired. The round missed high, struck the hillside behind C-21. The tank continued forward. At 150 yards, the Japanese gun fired again. The round hit C-21's front glacis plate. The armor held. The tank shuddered from the impact. The driver maintained course, 125 yards. The flame gun's maximum effective range was 150 yards, but accuracy decreased with distance. Ronson wanted certainty. He wanted to burn out that pillbox completely. 100 yards. The Japanese gun was reloading. The crew was panicking. They could see the American tank was different. No main gun barrel, just a strange tube. They didn't understand what it was. They were about to learn. At 90 yards, Ronson ordered fire. The gunner pressed the trigger. The auxiliary engine engaged. The fuel pump activated. Napalm fuel shot through the flame gun at 200 pounds per square inch pressure. The electrical igniter created an arc. The fuel ignited. A stream of burning napalm erupted from the flame gun and arced toward the pillbox. The stream was 30 feet wide at the target. Temperature approximately 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The burning fuel hit the pillbox's firing port and poured inside. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The napalm adhered to everything inside the pillbox: walls, floor, ceiling, equipment, and men. The defenders tried to escape. 2 made it out of the rear entrance. Both were on fire. They collapsed after 10 feet. The mountain gun's ammunition exploded from the heat. The explosion blew out the firing port. Black smoke poured from the pillbox. After 30 seconds, nothing moved inside. The position was neutralized. The Marines could advance. Ronson's crew watched in silence. They had seen combat. They had seen men die. But this was different. The flamethrower didn't just kill, it incinerated. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. American infantry were grateful the pillbox was destroyed. They were also horrified by the method. Japanese defenders who witnessed the attack transmitted warnings across the defensive network. A new American weapon. Fire that couldn't be stopped. The warnings used a specific phrase: fire dragons. Over the next 3 days, C-21 engaged 23 fortified positions, pillboxes, bunkers, and cave entrances. The pattern was consistent. Approach under covering fire from standard tanks and artillery, close to 100 yards. Fire a 3 to 5 second burst of napalm. Withdraw while the position burned. Infantry would advance and secure the position. The tactic worked. The casualty rate for assaults supported by flame tanks was 60% lower than assaults without flame tank support. But the flame tanks paid a price. Japanese forces recognized the threat. Anti-tank guns received orders to prioritize flame tanks. The tanks looked similar to standard Shermans, but Japanese spotters learned to identify them by the absence of muzzle brakes and the distinctive fuel tank configuration. Once identified, flame tanks received concentrated fire. 3 flame tanks were destroyed in the first week. Crews killed. The survivors understood they were priority targets. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was significant. Radio intercepts documented the fear. Defenders reported that conventional weapons were ineffective against the fire dragons. The napalm penetrated firing ports, filled bunkers, suffocated crews who weren't burned. The heat was unbearable. Defenders would abandon positions when flame tanks approached. Some committed suicide rather than face the flames. The fear was tactical advantage for American forces. Japanese tactical responses evolved. Defenders began sealing firing ports with steel plates when flame tanks approached. The plates reduced effectiveness, but didn't eliminate it. Napalm would pour through any opening. Ventilation shafts, drainage channels, any gap. Some bunkers had multiple entrances. Flame tanks would attack one entrance. Defenders would retreat to another section, then return after the tank withdrew. The cat-and-mouse game continued. The most effective Japanese countermeasure was close-range anti-tank fire, waiting until flame tanks were within 50 yards, then firing from concealed positions. At 50 yards, even 47mm guns could penetrate Sherman armor. 2 flame tanks were destroyed this way. Crews burned to death when their fuel tanks ruptured. The other flame tank crews learned. They never approached suspected anti-tank positions without infantry support. Infantry would suppress close-range threats while the flame tank engaged the fortification. On February 23, 1945, the American flag was raised on Mount Suribachi. The image became iconic, but the battle was far from over. The northern portion of Iwo Jima remained heavily fortified. Japanese forces occupied a complex of caves and tunnels in the rocky hills. Artillery couldn't reach them. Infantry couldn't dig them out. The flame tanks would have to burn them out. The terrain in northern Iwo Jima was nightmarish. Volcanic rock formations created natural fortifications. Ravines and canyons channeled attacking forces into kill zones. Every hill concealed bunkers. Every cave entrance was defended. The Japanese had months to prepare. They used the time well. The defensive positions were mutually supporting. Attacking one position exposed forces to fire from 3 others. Conventional tactics resulted in massive casualties. C-21 participated in the assault on Hill 362A on February 27th. The hill was a maze of bunkers and interconnected tunnels. Japanese forces could move underground between positions, suppress one bunker, and defenders would appear at another. The 5th Marine Division had been attacking the hill for 2 days. Burn out every bunker, every cave, every defensive position. The flame tank advanced with 4 standard Shermans. The standard tanks provided covering fire. C-21 provided the killing weapon. The first bunker was 80 yards up the hill. Concrete and volcanic rock construction. Firing ports covering the approach. A 47mm anti-tank gun inside. C-21 climbed the hill at maximum speed. Approximately 8 miles per hour on the rough terrain, the anti-tank gun fired. The round hit C-21's turret. The armor held, but the impact was violent. Ronson's head hit the turret roof. Blood ran into his eyes. He ignored it. The tank continued climbing. 90 yards, 80 yards. The anti-tank gun fired again. Miss. The round struck rocks beside the tank. 70 yards. At 65 yards, Ronson ordered fire. The flame gun erupted. Burning napalm arced across the distance and poured into the bunker's firing port. The defenders inside had no chance. The napalm filled the bunker in seconds. Temperature inside exceeded 3,000 degrees. The anti-tank gun's ammunition cooked off. The explosion blew the bunker's rear wall out. Marines watching from below saw the fireball. 3 Japanese soldiers staggered out of the bunker. All were on fire. All died within seconds. C-21 continued up the hill. The second bunker was 40 yards from the first, connected by a trench. Ronson could see Japanese soldiers moving in the trench, retreating from the flame tank. He ordered the gunner to fire into the trench. The napalm poured into the open trench. The soldiers inside were incinerated. The napalm continued flowing down the trench toward the second bunker. It filled the bunker entrance. The defenders inside suffocated before they burned. By the end of the day, C-21 had destroyed 14 defensive positions on Hill 362A. Infantry casualties during the assault were 40% lower than the previous 2 days. The hill was secured by nightfall. The Marines credited the flame tanks. Without them, the assault would have taken another 3 days and cost another 200 casualties. The flame tanks were proving their value, but the cost was high. On March 2, 1945, flame tank C-17 was hit by a 47mm anti-tank round while supporting an assault near Nishi Ridge. The round penetrated the fuel tank. The napalm ignited instantly. The explosion blew the turret off the tank. All 5 crew members died. The fire burned for 30 minutes. Nothing remained but charred metal and ash. The other flame tank crews understood. If their fuel tank was hit, they would die the same way. The psychological burden on flame tank crews was immense. They were killing with fire, burning men alive. The weapon was effective but morally difficult. Some crew members requested transfers. Most stayed. They understood the mission. Every bunker they burned out meant fewer Marines killed by machine gun fire. Every position they neutralized saved American lives. The calculus was brutal but clear. Japanese soldiers burning in bunkers meant American Marines surviving the assault. Infantry attitudes toward flame tanks were complex. Marines were grateful for the support, grateful that someone else was facing the fire ports and machine guns. But they were also disturbed by the weapon's effects. After a flame attack, bunkers contained charred remains that barely resembled human beings. The smell was terrible. Burning flesh, burning diesel, burning volcanic rock. The combination was nauseating. Marines who fought on Iwo Jima never forgot that smell. Japanese defenders adapted their tactics throughout the battle. By early March, Japanese forces were avoiding direct engagement with flame tanks when possible. Defenders would evacuate positions when flame tanks approached, retreat through tunnels, reoccupy positions after the tanks withdrew. The cat and mouse continued. American forces developed counter-tactics. Infantry would follow immediately behind flame attacks. Secure positions before defenders could return. Seal tunnel entrances with explosives. Prevent reoccupation. The battle's final phase occurred in mid-March. Japanese forces were compressed into the island's northern tip. Approximately 3,000 defenders remained. All were in fortified positions. All were determined to fight to the death. The terrain was impossible. Steep ravines, rocky outcrops, natural caves. The defensive positions were the strongest on the island. American casualties were predicted to be catastrophic. C-21 was one of 4 flame tanks still operational. 3 had been destroyed, 5 damaged and under repair. The remaining 4 would support the final assault. The plan was methodical. Standard tanks would provide covering fire. Flame tanks would advance and burn out positions. Infantry would follow and secure. The tactics had worked throughout the battle. They would work in the final assault. Probably hills. The complex contained approximately 300 Japanese defenders, multiple cave entrances connected by tunnels. Well supplied, well defended. Previous assaults had failed. The Marines needed the flame tanks. Bronson's crew understood the mission. This would be their hardest fight. The assault began at dawn. Artillery pounded the cave entrances for 30 minutes. The bombardment had no effect. The caves were too deep. The defenders were protected. When the artillery lifted, Japanese machine guns opened fire immediately. The 1st Marine platoon took casualties before advancing 20 yards. The assault stalled. The flame tanks were ordered forward. C-21 approached the first cave entrance at 7:30. The cave was 15 feet high and 20 feet wide. A natural formation improved by Japanese engineers. Machine gun positions flanked the entrance. Bronson could see muzzle flashes from inside the cave. The defenders were firing. Infantry couldn't approach. Bronson ordered the driver forward. The tank advanced to within 60 yards. The machine gun fire intensified. Rounds sparked off the tank's armor. The tank was taking hits, but not penetrating. At 50 yards, Bronson ordered fire. The flame gun erupted. Napalm poured into the cave entrance. The stream penetrated 40 feet into the cave before gravity pulled it down. The napalm splashed across the cave floor and walls. Everything burned. The machine guns stopped firing. Screaming came from inside the cave. Japanese soldiers ran out of the entrance. All were on fire. They died in the open. Infantry watched from cover. Nobody moved to help. Nothing could help. Bronson fired 3 more bursts into the cave. The napalm accumulated inside. The temperature became unsurvivable. Defenders deeper in the tunnel system suffocated from smoke and heat. Some retreated to other cave entrances. Some died where they stood. After 5 minutes, no more movement came from the cave. The position was neutralized. The Marines advanced and secured the entrance. C-21 engaged 6 more cave entrances that day. The pattern was consistent. Approach under covering fire. Close to 50 to 60 yards. Fire napalm into the entrance. Withdraw while the position burned. By nightfall, the cave complex was secured. Estimated 200 Japanese defenders killed. Marine casualties were 23 killed and 67 wounded. Without the flame tanks, casualties would have exceeded 300. The flame tanks had saved lives. Again. The battle for Iwo Jima ended on March 26, 1945. Organized Japanese resistance ceased. Small groups of defenders remained in several months. The island was secure. The cost was staggering. 26,000 American casualties, 6,800 killed, nearly 20,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were approximately 21,000. Only 216 Japanese soldiers surrendered. The rest died fighting. The flame tanks' contribution to the battle was significant. 8 flame tanks participated in the assault. 5 were destroyed, 3 survived. The tanks engaged approximately 600 fortified positions during the 36-day battle. Bunkers, pillboxes, and caves. Estimated 3,000 Japanese defenders were killed by flame attacks. The tanks provided support for infantry assaults that would otherwise have been impossible. Marine casualties in assaults supported by flame tanks were 50 to 60% lower than unsupported assaults. Sergeant Ronson survived the battle. C-21 was damaged on March 14th by a near miss from a 75mm gun. The track was damaged, but the tank remained operational. Ronson and his crew completed the battle. They returned to the United States in May 1945. Ronson left the Marine Corps in 1946. He never spoke publicly about his time as a flame tank commander. The memories were too difficult. The flame tank concept was validated on Iwo Jima. The Marine Corps ordered additional flame tanks for the invasion of Okinawa. 54 new M4A3R3 tanks were shipped to the Pacific in April 1945. They saw extensive action during the Okinawa campaign. The tactics developed on Iwo Jima were refined and standardized. Flame tanks became integral to Marine Corps assault doctrine against fortified positions. The Japanese Fire Dragon designation spread throughout Japanese defensive forces. Captured documents from Okinawa included specific warnings about American flame tanks. Defenders were instructed to evacuate positions when fire dragons approached. The instructions acknowledged that conventional defensive tactics were ineffective against flame weapons. The psychological impact was significant. Fear of the fire dragons reduced defensive effectiveness across multiple battles. Post-war analysis examined flame tank effectiveness. The Marine Corps Historical Division studied engagement reports from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The data was clear. Flame tanks destroyed fortified positions at rates conventional weapons could not match. A single flame tank could neutralize positions that would require days of artillery bombardment and multiple infantry assaults. The casualty reduction was measurable. Flame tank-supported assaults resulted in 50 to 70% fewer casualties than conventional assaults. But the weapon remained controversial. The use of flame weapons generated ethical debates that continue today. International law prohibits using flame weapons against civilian populations. Military use against fortified positions is legal but morally complex. The weapon causes extreme suffering. Defenders die horrible deaths. The psychological impact on both victims and operators is severe. Some military ethicists argue flame weapons should be prohibited entirely. Others argue they reduce overall casualties by making assaults more effective. The Marine Corps maintained flame tank units through the Korean War. M4A3R3 flame tanks saw action at Incheon and during the advance north. They were effective against North Korean bunkers. The tactics were identical to Iwo Jima. Approach undercover, burn out positions, withdraw. The results were consistent. High effectiveness, reduced infantry casualties, continued controversy. Vietnam saw the last operational use of American flame tanks. M67A2 flame tanks, upgraded versions of the M4A3R3, operated from 1965 to 1968. They engaged bunkers and fortified villages. Effectiveness was high, but political opposition to flame weapons was intense. Images of burning villages generated domestic controversy. The Marine Corps withdrew flame tanks from service in 1969. The weapon was too effective to abandon, but too controversial to continue using. Modern militaries use thermobaric weapons as flame weapon replacements. Thermobaric warheads create overpressure and heat without persistent flames. The weapons achieve similar effects with less visible suffering. Bunkers are destroyed, defenders are killed. But the deaths are from overpressure rather than burning. The psychological impact is reduced. The ethical debates continue. No M4A3R3 flame tanks survive in operating condition. Several are preserved in museums. The Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, Virginia, displays an M4A3R3 that served on Iwo Jima. The tank is cosmetically restored but mechanically inactive. The flame system has been deactivated. The napalm tanks are empty. The tank is a memorial to the crews who operated these weapons under impossible conditions. The crews who operated flame tanks deserve recognition that often eludes them. They used a horrible weapon to accomplish a necessary mission. They killed enemy soldiers in the most brutal way possible. They did this to save the lives of their fellow Marines. The psychological burden was immense. Many flame tank veterans suffered post-traumatic stress. Some never recovered. They carried the memories of burning men for the rest of their lives. But their contribution to victory was real. The flame tanks broke defensive lines that conventional weapons could not penetrate. They enabled assaults that would otherwise have been suicidal. They saved lives by taking lives. The calculus was brutal, but the results were measurable. Thousands of Marines survived Iwo Jima because flame tanks eliminated the bunkers that would have killed them. The Japanese defenders who faced the fire dragons showed courage under terrifying circumstances. They maintained defensive positions knowing the flame tanks would come. They fought knowing they would probably burn to death. Some evacuated when flame tanks approached. Many did not. They stayed in their bunkers and died at their posts. Their courage deserves acknowledgement even as we recognize they served an unjust cause. War produces weapons of increasing brutality. Each generation develops more efficient methods of killing. Flame weapons represent one extreme. They kill slowly. They kill painfully. They create visible suffering. Modern weapons kill more efficiently with less visible suffering. But the end result is the same. Men die. The question is whether efficient killing is more ethical than brutal killing. The debate continues. What remains clear is that desperate circumstances produce desperate solutions. Iwo Jima presented a tactical problem that conventional weapons could not solve. Japanese fortifications were too strong. Infantry casualties were too high. Something had to change. The flame tanks changed the equation. They provided a weapon that could defeat the fortifications. The weapon was terrible. The alternative was worse. The story of the flame tanks and the fire dragons they became in Japanese imagination illustrates the evolution of warfare. Technology advances. Tactics adapt. Weapons become more effective. But the human cost remains constant. Soldiers die. Operators suffer psychological trauma. The weapons may change, but the burden on those who use them does not. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about Marine tankers who, at 6:45 on February 21, 1945, Sergeant Robert Ronson watched his M4A3R3 Sherman flame tank idle at the edge of Iwo Jima's 3rd airfield. The tank carried 290 gallons of napalm fuel. The main gun had been replaced with an E4-5 flamethrower capable of projecting ignited fuel 100.
The jungles of Saipan weren't just filled with gunfire, they screamed. It was 1944, and the night was alive with chanting, steel, and something far older than war itself. For years, Japanese banzai charges had broken Allied lines through sheer terror and willpower. But this time, they met a new kind of horror. It didn't use bullets, it used fire. What began as a top-secret project in quiet American labs would turn into the weapon that ended the myth of unstoppable courage. This is the story of the M2 flamethrower, how a single invention turned the tide of the Pacific War and changed the psychology of combat forever. This is no man's land. Subscribe and step into the fire. Before Saipan turned into a furnace of steel and fire, the Pacific War had already carved a grim rhythm into the minds of every Marine. From the beaches of Guadalcanal to the coral atolls of Tarawa, one truth repeated itself. The Japanese did not surrender. They fought until nothing was left to fight with. Every cave became a fortress. Every trench, a tomb. It wasn't strategy, it was belief. The Bushido Code had been reshaped into something darker. A creed that glorified death in service of the emperor and condemned surrender as eternal shame. Officers told their men that capture meant torture, that the Americans would defile them. So they charged again and again. Their last breath turned into a scream for 10,000 years of the emperor's reign. These bonsai charges were more than physical attacks. They were weapons of terror. They struck not just flesh, but nerves. Waves of screaming soldiers stormed through gunfire, their faces lit by explosions, their resolve unbroken even as they fell. Some carried rifles, others only swords or grenades strapped to their chests. It was chaos that dared the human mind to stay calm, and many young Marines couldn't. Some froze, others fired blindly. It didn't matter how many Japanese soldiers were killed. The momentum of the charge often shattered the line before it reached them. Commanders studied the pattern with growing dread. Conventional weapons, rifles, mortars, even artillery could kill the men, but they couldn't stop the madness behind them. Every island campaign felt like déjà vu, an endless cycle of blood and courage that no amount of bullets could erase. The Americans had technology, the Japanese had conviction. But conviction, as they would learn, can only survive until it meets something more terrifying than itself. By 1944, U.S. command knew the cycle had to end. They didn't need a new gun. They needed a new kind of fear. The solution to breaking the unstoppable charge didn't come from the front lines. It came from the laboratories, where engineers studied not courage, but chemistry. The U.S. military had seen flamethrowers before. The Germans had used them during World War I. Crude devices that hurled burning fuel across trenches, but were just as dangerous to the men who carried them. They sputtered, leaked, and exploded if hit. Yet the idea lingered. Fire was absolute. Fire consumed everything, left no cover, no second chances. By the early years of World War II, America's scientists revisited that ancient weapon with a modern twist. How to make it portable, reliable, and deadly enough to change the course of jungle warfare. In makeshift workshops scattered across the Pacific, they began crafting something new. The M2 flamethrower, officially known as the M2-2. It wasn't elegant. It was heavy, brutal, and simple. Two cylindrical tanks filled with fuel were strapped to the operator's back, while a smaller nitrogen tank provided pressure. A hose connected to a handheld wand that could project fire farther than anyone thought possible, about 30 yards. The fuel itself was gasoline thickened with a new compound called napalm, a sticky, burning gel that clung to anything it touched and refused to go out. When the trigger was squeezed, compressed nitrogen forced the napalm through the nozzle where a small ignition flame turned it into a jet of liquid fire. Fully loaded, the M2 weighed around 70 pounds and could sustain about 7 seconds of continuous flame. 7 seconds! That was all it took to turn a jungle ridge into an inferno. The weapon wasn't built for beauty or comfort. It was built for results. Marines who first saw it didn't realize they were holding a device that would redefine warfare. It wasn't just a weapon. It was portable fear. ready to be unleashed in a world where courage alone was no longer enough to survive. Every Marine who strapped on an M2 flamethrower knew what it meant. The moment that bulky twin tank settled onto your back, you became the first target on the battlefield. The enemy didn't need to see your face. The silhouette of those cylinders was enough. Snipers were trained to find it, to aim for the tanks, and to turn you into a living explosion. The weight alone, nearly 70 pounds, dragged at your spine and slowed your every step. Each movement clanked and hissed with the sound of valves and pressure. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a burden that demanded both courage and precision, because one mistake could ignite everything behind you. Training was intense and unforgiving. Marines learned to work in pairs, the flamethrower operator and his protector, a rifleman whose job was to guard him at all costs. In practice fields across the Pacific, they rehearsed the same deadly dance: advance, crouch, fire, retreat. Timing was survival. If the operator lost balance or twisted the hose too sharply, he risked rupturing a line. A single tracer round could pierce the tank and turn the operator into a fireball. Yet, despite the danger, there were volunteers, men who saw the weapon not as a curse, but as a challenge. They called themselves the torchbearers, half in pride, half in dark humor. But there was another battle, one no manual could prepare them for, the moral one. Shooting an enemy from a distance was one thing. Watching a human being consumed by fire was another. The screams, the smell, the sight of bodies twisting in agony. It carved into the mind. Some operators vomited after their first mission. Others went silent for days. Still, they shouldered the tanks and went back. They understood what officers had already learned. Against an enemy who refused surrender, mercy became a luxury. In the jungles of the Pacific, survival demanded fire, and the men who carried it had to become both weapon and witness to war's darkest truth: that fear itself could be engineered. By the summer of 1944, the American advance across the Pacific had become a brutal chess game of island hopping. Each move brought them closer to Japan's homeland, but each new square on the map bled more men. Then came Saipan, the key to it all. Barely 15 miles long, this island in the Marianas chain was more than just coral and jungle. It was the perfect runway. From Saipan, America's new B-29 Superfortress bombers could strike Tokyo itself. Both sides knew its value, and both knew that whoever held it would decide the fate of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese fortified Saipan with 31,000 troops, artillery hidden in limestone cliffs, and underground tunnels that made the island a honeycomb of death. They swore no American would ever set foot there alive. On June 15, 1944, 8,000 U.S. Marines hit the beaches in the first wave. Within minutes, the sea turned red. Artillery rained down from the ridges. Machine guns scythed through the surf. Still, they advanced, inch by inch, building shallow foxholes under fire. By nightfall, the Marines had carved out a fragile line on the beach. But as dusk settled over the island, Japanese commanders prepared a counterattack unlike anything the Marines had faced before. They gathered their wounded, distributed sake, sharpened bayonets, and gave one final order: die with honor for the Emperor. Every surviving soldier on Saipan, from veteran officer to teenage recruit, would take part in one last all-out banzai charge. The Marines heard it before they saw it, a deep chant rolling through the jungle, swelling like thunder. Then came the glint of bayonets under flares, Thousands of silhouettes surged forward in unison, screaming 10,000 years as they crashed against the American lines. This was no tactic. It was ritual suicide, human waves hurling themselves at machine guns and mortars. But among the Marines that night were new figures crouched behind the ridges, their tanks gleaming in the moonlight. The M2 flamethrower had arrived in battle, and the jungle was about to burn. Just after midnight on July 7, 1944, the largest bonsai charge of the entire Pacific War erupted across the ridges of Saipan. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers stormed through the jungle, drunk on adrenaline and sake, screaming the Emperor's name as they charged into a wall of American fire. From the darkness, flares burst overhead, turning the jungle into a surreal daylight of smoke and motion. Marines in foxholes gripped their rifles as the sound of thousands of boots closed in, followed by the metallic hiss of blades and the guttural roar of voices, too many to count. Then came a sound no one had heard before, a violent hiss, like a giant serpent exhaling. From the Marine lines, jets of liquid fire arced into the night. The first flamethrower operator to open up was a 19-year-old private from Ohio. He'd never used the weapon in combat before. When he squeezed the trigger, pressurized nitrogen forced the thick napalm through the nozzle and out into the charging mass. The jungle lit up instantly. Flames clung to uniforms, trees, and flesh alike, spreading faster than the eye could follow. The charge that had terrified American soldiers for years suddenly faltered in chaos. Screams of bonsai turned into screams of agony. Napalm didn't just burn. It stuck. It coated everything it touched, turning the air itself into a weapon. The heat was so intense that ammunition belts detonated where they lay. Grenades cooked off in soldiers' hands, and the very leaves above their heads ignited. The fire consumed oxygen, choking the night in smoke. The once green ridges glowed orange, alive with moving shadows. Some human, some no longer recognizable. Yet the charge didn't end. Even as hundreds burned, others kept coming through the inferno. Faces blackened, bayonets fixed. For the Marines, it felt like fighting ghosts that refused to die. The flamethrower operators held their ground, cycling through their 7-second bursts, while riflemen shielded them from snipers. The air reeked of burning oil and flesh. In those few minutes, something fundamental in the war shifted. Courage no longer decided victory. Chemistry did. And for the first time in the Pacific, fire became strategy. When the first tanks of napalm ran dry, silence didn't follow. Only the low crackle of burning trees and the distant thud of grenades. The bonsai charge had broken through in scattered pockets, and Marines now fought at arm's length, bayonets clashing, fists swinging, knives flashing in the firelight. The ground was slick with mud, oil, and blood. Amid that chaos, the men who carried the M2 flamethrowers became both saviors and targets. Japanese soldiers quickly learned that killing a flamethrower operator could stop the fire and open a gap in the line. They aimed for the tanks. Bullets pinged off the curved steel shells, and when one found its mark, the explosion lit the night like a miniature sun. Private Harding, his weapon empty, grabbed his carbine and fought beside the riflemen he'd been assigned to protect. Across the ridge, other operators tried to reposition under covering fire. The tanks weighed over 70 pounds, and every step through the mud felt like dragging an anchor. Some men fell, crushed by their own gear when hit. Others kept moving, shoulders steaming from heat, faces blackened with soot. The Marines guarding them shouted targets. clearing lanes so the flamethrowers could advance. It was a brutal, coordinated rhythm. Riflemen shooting at range, flamethrowers sweeping close, each protecting the other. Each operator knew his weapon's limitation. Only 7 seconds of fire per tank load. But those 7 seconds could erase a charge, collapse a bunker, or buy precious time for wounded comrades to be pulled back. When a burst hit its mark, the results were absolute. Entire sections of jungle ignited, the flames moving faster than any man could run. What made it more terrifying was the silence afterward. No gunfire, no movement, only the faint roar of flames eating through vegetation and flesh. By dawn, the jungle around Saipan looked like the surface of another planet. Charred trees jutted like black fingers from smoldering soil. Bodies, friend and foe alike, lay twisted among the ash. The M2 flamethrower had done its job. The largest bonsai charge in history was over, and the era of mass suicide attacks had burned away with it. By sunrise on July 7, 1944, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The air still shimmered with heat, smoke drifted low across the ridges, and the stench of burned oil and flesh hung heavy enough to taste. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead, their once unbreakable charge reduced to ash and silence. More than 2,500 had been killed in just a few hours. The Marines, though battered and sleepless, had held the line, and in doing so, they had witnessed something far larger than a single victory. The myth of the unstoppable bonsai charge had been broken, not by courage, but by chemistry. The flamethrowers' 7-second bursts had done more than clear jungle. They had changed psychology. For years, Japanese soldiers had fought with an almost spiritual invincibility, believing that death in battle meant eternal honor. But fire rewrote that belief. It was the one force they could neither fight nor endure. It consumed honor, erased courage, and denied the dignity of dying with a sword in hand. Captured documents later revealed that Japanese troops feared flamethrowers more than tanks, mortars, or machine guns. One officer wrote, "The fire weapon is not of this world." For the Marines, though, victory came with a cost. The men who carried the M2 weren't celebrated heroes. They were haunted ones. Many refused to speak about what they'd done. Burning men alive, even enemies, left marks that no medal could hide. Veterans later admitted that the sound of igniting fuel haunted their dreams for decades. Yet in the cold arithmetic of war, the weapon had worked. Each cave cleared by fire meant dozens of Marines spared from crawling inside with grenades. Each broken charge meant fewer American graves. From Saipan forward, the bonsai tactic nearly vanished. The Japanese army, once defined by fearless offense, shifted to desperate defense, digging deeper, building networks of caves, forcing Americans to fight inch by inch. The balance of terror had flipped. The flame had done what bullets never could. It had taught even the most fanatical warriors to fear. After Saipan, the lessons spread faster than the flames that had scorched its jungles. What began as an improvised weapon carried by a few Marines soon became an essential tool of the U.S. military machine. The M2 flamethrower evolved from a defensive device into the backbone of America's island-by-island advance. By the time the Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, every division had dedicated flamethrower platoons. They trained day and night to clear caves, tunnels, and pillboxes that artillery couldn't reach. On volcanic terrain where even tanks struggled to climb, these men became the point of the spear, walking into darkness with nothing but a tank of napalm and 7 seconds of hell. Iwo Jima was a fortress built into the earth itself. Beneath the black sand beaches and jagged ridges, the Japanese had carved more than 10 miles of tunnels, bunkers, and chambers stocked with ammunition and food. They had no plans to retreat. Their orders were simple: fight until death. Take as many Americans with them as possible. Machine guns and grenades couldn't reach them in their caves. Artillery only sealed the entrances. The solution once again came down to fire. Flamethrower teams advanced in pairs, crawling under fire to the mouths of caves. Riflemen and demolition experts flanked them, laying suppressive fire while the operators braced their tanks and aimed. The first burst filled the cave with a roar that drowned out everything: wind, gunfire, even thought. The flames raced inward, devouring oxygen and coating rock walls with burning napalm. The temperature inside those tunnels climbed past 2,000 degrees. Within seconds, defenders either fled screaming into machine gun fire or suffocated where they stood. It was not just destruction, it was total erasure. One Marine described it years later: "You didn't just kill them, you erased the air they breathed." The statement was cold, but accurate. Flamethrowers didn't just win battles, they changed the nature of them. But the cost to the men who wielded the fire was immense. Flamethrower operators had a life expectancy measured in minutes once the assault began. Japanese snipers learned to target the tanks first, and a single hit could incinerate an entire squad. The operators knew it, yet still stepped forward. They fought in teams of 2, one man carrying, one protecting. Many times, the protector died first. Those who survived often came back with burns of their own. Their gear melted, their eyes blackened by soot. At Okinawa, the final and bloodiest battle of the Pacific, the flamethrower became the weapon of choice. Japanese troops had abandoned the idea of open battle entirely. They dug deep into the limestone hills, creating labyrinths of death. The Marines responded with methodical fury. Each cave was cleared systematically. Grenades first, flame next. Engineers mounted flamethrowers on Sherman tanks, creating mobile infernos that could bathe entire hillsides in fire. It was efficient, it was devastating, and it was horrifying. By mid-1945, the flamethrower had transformed from a tactical weapon into a symbol of American dominance and of the war's growing moral decay. What began as a desperate answer to suicidal charges had become standard procedure. Villages, jungles, and caves all burned the same. Fire became shorthand for victory. Yet, in the aftermath of each battle, as Marines stood over smoldering caves and looked down at what they'd done, a question lingered. How much of their own humanity had they burned away with it? Commanders justified the weapon with numbers: fewer Marine deaths, faster victories, shorter battles. But among the troops, the emotional weight was heavier than any fuel tank. One survivor wrote, "The fire saved my life 100 times. I just wish I didn't have to see what it did to theirs." Saipan had taught the military that fear could be engineered. Iwo Jima and Okinawa proved that it could be industrialized. Entire landscapes turned to ash in the name of progress. And as the war neared Japan's mainland, planners looked at their maps and saw a terrifying future. A homeland made of wood, paper, and bamboo. If the invasion went forward, the fire that had consumed the islands would soon consume the nation. The M2 flamethrower, once a stopgap weapon, was now part of something much larger. A philosophy of warfare where annihilation replaced honor, and victory meant survival at any cost. The fire that ended the Bonsai Charge was about to light the path to Japan's doorstep. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Flamethrowers' story didn't end with it. It simply went quiet. The weapon that had stopped the Banzai charge at Saipan and turned the caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa into firestorms was suddenly out of place in a world trying to rebuild. Soldiers returned home as heroes, but the men who had carried the M2 weren't celebrated in parades. They were haunted by the smell of burning napalm and the screams they could never unhear. The army packed the flamethrowers into crates, buried them in storage, and let history move on without mentioning what those 7 seconds of fire had done. Yet the weapon's legacy never really disappeared. It evolved. The same chemical principles behind the M2's thickened gasoline became the foundation for napalm bombing, a far larger and deadlier form of the same terror. From Korea to Vietnam, jets carried forward the lesson born in the jungles of Saipan. Fire didn't just destroy, it controlled. It dictated movement, broke morale, and rewrote the limits of fear. In a way, every airstrike that turned night into day was an echo of that first jet of flame fired by a 19-year-old Marine on a dark Pacific ridge. But beneath the statistics and military triumphs, the human cost lingered. Japanese survivors who had lived through flamethrower attacks spoke of the weapon not with hatred, but with a kind of horrified awe. One veteran said, "It made us understand that the gods had left us." The traditional Bushido belief in honor through death had no defense against a weapon that reduced men to ash before they could even fight. For Americans, too, the moral wound ran deep. Many operators confessed decades later that they had never spoken of their actions, not even to their families. They'd been trained to survive, not to process the things survival required. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt and America turned to the atomic age, the flamethrower faded from memory, overshadowed by the bomb that ended everything in a single flash. Yet in a dark, poetic way, the M2 had foreshadowed Hiroshima. Both were born from the same idea, that total destruction could save lives by ending war faster. Both proved that once fire becomes strategy, humanity loses something it can't regain. Today, the M2 flamethrower sits in museums, often behind glass, polished and silent. Tourists see a relic. Historians see innovation. But those who truly understand its story see something else, a mirror held up to mankind's capacity for both invention and horror. The weapon that stopped the charge also burned away the illusions of noble warfare. It forced the world to confront a new kind of truth, that victory and morality rarely share the same battlefield. On the blackened ridges of Saipan, rusted tanks still lie half-buried in the soil. The jungle has grown back, covering the scars, but dig deep enough, and the ground still smells faintly of fuel. The war may have ended, but the question it asked has never cooled. When survival demands fire, how much of your soul do you burn with it? If this story moved you, subscribe to No Man's Land to keep history's forgotten truths alive. Because behind every weapon, every victory, and every number, there's a story the world tried to forget, and someone who never could. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, the most feared weapon wasn't the flamethrower itself. It was the man carrying it. To Japanese defenders hidden deep inside tunnels and caves, the sight of a Marine with a fuel tank on his back meant only one thing: fire and death. When U.S. Marines first set eyes on Iwo Jima in February 1945, what they saw wasn't just another island. It was a black volcanic wasteland, covered in ash so fine it swallowed boots and stalled tanks. The The smell of sulfur hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder that the very ground they walked on was alive with heat and smoke. To American planners, it was nothing more than 8 square miles of rock, but to the Japanese, it was sacred ground, fortified into a fortress unlike anything the Marines had ever seen. The island sat halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, and from its 3 airfields, Japanese fighters launched raids against American bombers heading toward Tokyo. Taking it meant cutting off that threat, and more importantly, securing a base for future bombing runs on Japan itself. The cost, though, would be staggering. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, knew the Americans would come, and he refused to fight them the way his predecessors had. Instead of throwing his soldiers into suicidal banzai charges, he turned Iwo Jima into a labyrinth of steel and stone. More than 11 miles of tunnels were carved into the volcanic rock, connecting bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery positions. Caves were reinforced with concrete, and machine guns were hidden behind steel doors that opened only long enough to fire and then vanished again into the hillside. Kuribayashi ordered his men to inflict maximum casualties, to bleed the Americans until every inch of ground became a graveyard. Out of his 21,000 defenders, he expected none to survive, and he told them so. For the Marines, this was not just another beach landing. When they hit Iwo Jima's shores on February 19th, they weren't facing an army on the surface. They were facing ghosts buried in the earth, unseen until the instant they struck. Every rise of land hid a firing position, every cave mouth another potential ambush. Unlike the open beaches of Normandy, there was nowhere safe to run, nowhere to dig in. The black sand absorbed bullets, but also swallowed men, slowing them down until they became easy targets. This was a battlefield where movement meant exposure, and exposure meant death. And in this nightmarish landscape, one weapon would come to define the struggle: the flamethrower. To fight an enemy hidden underground, the Marines needed more than rifles and mortars. They needed a weapon that could reach into caves, suffocate defenders, and flush them out where nothing else could. That weapon was the flamethrower. To the average soldier, it looked like a death sentence strapped to the back. Twin fuel tanks connected to a long hose and nozzle, capable of spewing fire in liquid death. The tactical role of the flamethrower was straightforward but brutal. Riflemen and machine gunners would pin down a bunker. Then a flamethrower team moved in undercover, spraying fire into firing ports or cave entrances. The flames consumed the oxygen inside, suffocating defenders even if they weren't burned alive. In some cases, the weapon was used in combination with demolitions, satchel charges thrown in immediately after a burst of fire to seal the position forever. It was efficient, terrifying, and in many ways inhuman. The Japanese defenders described it as the most horrifying weapon on the battlefield. Worse than artillery, worse than tanks, because it left nothing untouched. For the Marines themselves, carrying a flamethrower was a paradox. On the one hand, it gave them immense power, the ability to silence a position their entire squad couldn't break. On the other, it turned them into a beacon for every Japanese sniper. The distinctive silhouette of the tanks made them instantly recognizable, and every defender knew exactly what they had to do when they saw one: kill the flamethrower man at any cost. Veterans would later recall how short a life expectancy could be in those moments, with some operators lasting only minutes once they were spotted. And yet, despite the danger, flamethrower troops were essential. Entire cave complexes fell only because a single Marine was willing to strap hellfire to his back and walk forward into the teeth of the enemy. For Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, there was no weapon more terrifying than the flamethrower. Artillery could be endured, bullets could be dodged, but fire had no mercy. When a flamethrower stream roared into a cave, it filled every corner with liquid flame, crawling along walls, dripping from ceilings, and devouring oxygen in seconds. Even those who weren't directly burned often suffocated, clawing at the air as smoke and heat consumed them. Survivors of such attacks described it as a living nightmare, where men were cooked alive inside their own fortifications. To be trapped in a tunnel with fire racing toward you was not just death, it was horror, and it burned itself into the minds of anyone who witnessed it. This deep fear shaped Japanese behavior on the battlefield. Soldiers swore to kill flamethrower operators above all others. Snipers were trained to scan the chaos of the battlefield, specifically for the silhouette of a man carrying twin fuel tanks. Machine gunners shifted their fire immediately if a flamethrower appeared. Even officers urged their men to prioritize these soldiers, considering them not just enemies, but monsters. For many defenders, there was an added cultural layer to this hatred. In Japanese tradition, fire was often associated with destruction and dishonor. To die by flame was considered a shameful end, one that erased the dignity of a warrior's death in battle. This made the flamethrower men not only feared, but despised. Propaganda and whispers spread quickly. Stories circulated of Marines who turned entire caves into ovens, leaving nothing but charred remains. To Japanese defenders, these stories reinforced the idea that flamethrower men were demons rather than soldiers. Some swore that no matter what, they would never allow themselves to be burned alive. Suicide grenades, last-stand charges, and even ritual self-destruction with pistols were preferred to the flames. In some cases, soldiers emerged from their hiding places in desperate banzai-style charges, throwing themselves directly at Marine lines rather than face the suffocating fire that awaited them underground. The hatred was so strong that even in moments of retreat, Japanese troops often bypassed Marines with rifles to hunt down the men carrying fuel tanks. On Iwo Jima, the flamethrower was not just a weapon, it was a curse, and those who wielded it were condemned as both executioners and prime targets. For the Marines carrying flamethrowers, survival often came down to minutes, sometimes seconds. The tanks on their backs made them look taller and bulkier than the men around them, instantly recognizable even in the smoke and chaos of battle. Every Japanese eye was trained to find that shape. The moment a flamethrower team appeared, a storm of bullets followed. Snipers perched in hidden firing holes waited patiently for hours, ignoring dozens of targets just to squeeze the trigger when a flamethrower entered their scope. Machine gunners opened up entire belts of ammunition to cut down one man. Mortar crews shifted their aim the second they spotted a glint off the tanks. To carry a flamethrower was to paint a bullseye on your back, and every Marine knew it. The danger wasn't just being targeted, it was the weapon itself. The tanks carried pressurized gasoline mixed with thickening agents, turning them into walking bombs. One stray bullet could ignite the fuel, setting the operator ablaze in a fiery death more terrifying than anything inflicted by the enemy. Veterans recalled the sickening sight of comrades erupting in flames after a single well-placed shot. Some died screaming in seconds. Others had to be shot by their own friends to end their agony. The mere possibility of this fate weighed heavily on the minds of flamethrower soldiers, who often joked grimly that they were carrying their own coffins onto the battlefield. And yet, despite knowing how short their odds were, these Marines pressed forward. They didn't have the luxury of hanging back. Without them, the caves and pillboxes remained invincible. Infantry squads often tried to shield flamethrower men, laying down covering fire or drawing attention away, but it was rarely enough. Once a Japanese defender caught sight of those tanks, nothing else mattered. In many cases, flamethrower operators were killed before they could even get within range of their targets. The Japanese hatred of them meant there was no mercy. Flamethrower men weren't just soldiers, they were the embodiment of the firestorm that haunted every defender's imagination. And for that reason, carrying the weapon was both the ultimate power and the ultimate death sentence. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima understood patience. Hidden in their labyrinth of tunnels, they sometimes let Marines pass unharmed, holding their fire for the one figure they wanted most, the man carrying a flamethrower. Operators later recalled the eerie sense of being watched. of knowing unseen eyes followed every step they took. Ordinary riflemen could crawl past certain caves without drawing fire, but when a flamethrower appeared, the silence erupted into chaos. Entire networks of guns and grenades zeroed in on a single target, the defenders seemingly united by a collective oath to eliminate the flamethrower first. For the operator, there was nowhere safe. The black sand offered no cover, only slowing their steps as bullets whipped overhead. Even when squads advanced with smoke screens, flamethrower men often found themselves betrayed by their own silhouette, the outline of their tanks cutting through the haze. Marines described the heart-stopping moments when tracer rounds zipped past their fuel tanks, every near miss threatening to turn them into human torches. For some, that fate came swiftly, one bullet puncturing the tanks, a flash of light, and then a man engulfed in flames. Witnesses were scarred by these scenes, remembering comrades writhing in fire while others screamed in helpless fury. But the horror didn't end there. Japanese defenders sometimes launched desperate tunnel sorties, crawling unseen beneath the surface to ambush flamethrower troops from the side or rear. In the confined chaos of Iwo Jima, operators often didn't realize they were targeted until grenades clattered at their feet or rifle fire tore into them from impossible angles. These ambushes created moments of brutal desperation, operators dropping their weapons to draw pistols, squads rushing to shield the doomed man, and firefights erupting in claustrophobic tunnels where survival was measured in seconds. The Japanese even adjusted their tactics to maximize fear. At times, they deliberately aimed at the legs or arms of flamethrower men rather than the tanks, leaving them crippled but alive, knowing the fire strapped to their back would claim them soon enough. This psychological cruelty reflected how much hatred the flamethrower inspired. To defenders who had seen comrades roasted alive, the men carrying these weapons weren't soldiers. They were monsters who had to be destroyed at all costs. And so, step by step, every flamethrower man on Iwo Jima lived with the knowledge that the moment he was spotted, he wasn't just a target, he was prey. The battle for Iwo Jima turned into one of the most savage clashes of the entire war, and nowhere was the desperation clearer than in the Japanese obsession with destroying flamethrower troops. Snipers who ran out of ammunition didn't retreat. They charged the men with knives, bayonets, or even their bare hands. Some defenders crawled through pitch-dark tunnels for hours to flank flamethrower positions, emerging suddenly from hidden exits to launch suicide attacks. Marines remembered the chilling sound of shouting enemies bursting from the earth itself, hurling grenades at the one man they had sworn to kill. There were darker stories too, whispered among veterans. Some Marines claimed that Japanese soldiers who managed to capture flamethrower operators subjected them to mutilation, exacting brutal revenge for the horrors those weapons had inflicted. While official reports rarely acknowledged such incidents, perhaps to avoid inflaming public opinion, rumors persisted that flamethrower men faced special torment if taken alive. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they reinforced a chilling truth. Flamethrower soldiers were fighting a war without mercy, where surrender was unlikely to be accepted on either side. The desperation extended to propaganda as well. Japanese leaflets and broadcasts painted flamethrower men as inhuman devils carrying fire into sacred ground. This dehumanization stoked the defenders' rage, convincing many that killing these men was more than just military necessity. It was a moral duty. And so, even when American squads overran positions, flamethrower operators often found themselves fighting hand-to-hand against enemies who bypassed others just to reach them. Marines who survived described the pressure as unbearable. Every time they strapped on the tanks, they knew the odds were stacked against them. One veteran later admitted, "You didn't need to be told you were first on the list. You felt it in the way they fought. Every bullet had your name. Yet despite the risks, these men pressed on. Without them, entire cave systems could not be cleared, and Marines would have suffered even higher losses. It was desperation on both sides, the Japanese fighting to annihilate the fire bearers, and the Americans relying on them as the only way to push forward. And in between those opposing forces stood men whose courage and sacrifice were measured not in hours or days, but often in the last few minutes. they lived. For the Marines tasked with carrying the flamethrower, the experience was unlike anything their comrades endured. Every man in the unit knew who had drawn the short straw, and even in training, the reputation of the weapon carried a weight that was hard to ignore. Operators were often chosen for their strength and stamina, but what really mattered was sheer willpower. Carrying nearly 70 pounds of fuel and equipment on your back through volcanic ash that swallowed your boots wasn't just exhausting. It was suffocating. Add to that the knowledge that you were the #1 target on the battlefield, and it created a psychological burden most soldiers couldn't imagine. Marines who carried the flamethrower later admitted to the crushing sense of isolation. Even though squads worked together, the man with the tanks always felt exposed. He knew that Japanese eyes scanned the battlefield not for the many, but for him alone. Veterans described how every movement felt heavier, every step accompanied by the certainty that somewhere, in some cave, a sniper was waiting. The weight of the tanks wasn't just physical, it was mental, a reminder that survival was often measured in minutes. Operators had to work in pairs, one man carrying the weapon, the other covering him with a rifle. Still, the relationship was rarely equal. The assistant knew his primary job was to keep the flamethrower man alive, but even he admitted the pressure of watching his partner become the enemy's obsession. Some Marines recalled shouting at their operators to get down, to wait, to hold back, but in the chaos of battle there was no choice. If a cave wasn't cleared, the entire squad was pinned down, and the responsibility always fell on the man with the fire. One Marine put it simply, "You felt the eyes on you before you ever fired a shot." That sensation, that invisible, suffocating feeling of being hunted, never left them. And yet, despite knowing their odds, these men walked forward. They knew their brothers relied on them. Clearing a single cave could save dozens of lives. The grim reality was that flamethrower operators weren't just soldiers. They were sacrifices. They accepted that their role often meant dying so others could live, and in that acceptance, they became both feared and respected among their fellow Marines. The irony of the battle was that while Japanese soldiers hated flamethrower operators with unmatched passion, they also feared them more than anything else. Entire caves and tunnel systems, manned by dozens of defenders, were silenced in seconds by a single burst of flame. Survivors often chose suicide over capture, detonating grenades against their chests, rather than waiting for the fire to reach them. Some Marines described hearing muffled explosions inside caves before they ever fired, realizing the defenders had chosen to end themselves rather than face the inevitable. Flamethrower attacks created a ripple effect across the battlefield. Once a single cave went quiet, other nearby positions sometimes fell into panic, men abandoning tunnels rather than risk being sealed in by fire. The weapon, though limited in range and endurance, carried a psychological weight far greater than its physical destruction. Marines who survived Iwo Jima later admitted that the flamethrower was as much a weapon of terror as it was of tactics. One veteran said, "When the fire hit, the fight was over. They either ran or died where they stood." But the grim truth was that the men carrying these weapons rarely lived long enough to savor their effectiveness. Many were cut down before they reached their target, their flamethrowers lying useless in the ash beside their bodies. Others managed to unleash a few bursts before collapsing under concentrated fire. Entire squads sometimes lost multiple flamethrower men in a single day, forcing replacements to strap on the tanks, knowing full well what awaited them. Still, the weapon remained indispensable. There was simply no other way to flush out defenders hidden deep inside bunkers reinforced against artillery. Every victory on Iwo Jima's volcanic slopes was bought with the lives of those willing to strap a bomb to their back and march into hell. The fire they carried ended countless Japanese strongholds, but the cost was brutal. For every cave silenced, a flamethrower man often paid the price, reminding everyone around him that in the nightmare of Iwo Jima, survival was always fleeting, and fire consumed more than just the enemy. September 1944. U.S. commanders predicted the island of Peleliu could be taken in 3 days. Instead, the battle dragged on for over 2 months and cost more lives than anyone imagined. On this tiny coral speck, American Marines and Japanese defenders collided in one of the most brutal clashes of World War II. By the end, casualty rates soared as high as 78% in some units. Entire companies wiped from existence. This wasn't just another island battle. It was a blood-soaked lesson in miscalculation, hubris, and unimaginable sacrifice. And the shocking truth? Much of it may have been for nothing. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive turning point. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had clawed their way across the Central Pacific, smashing through Japanese strongholds in the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. The once seemingly invincible Imperial Navy was now on the defensive, bleeding ships and planes at a rate it could not replace. For American commanders, the question was not if Japan would fall, but how to bring about that collapse most efficiently, and at what cost. Inside the upper levels of Allied command, 2 powerful figures argued over the next move. General Douglas MacArthur, still burning to redeem his forced withdrawal from the Philippines in 1942, insisted on fulfilling his promise to return. In his view, recapturing the Philippines was both a moral and strategic necessity. It would cut Japan off from vital resources in Southeast Asia and restore America's credibility in Asia. On the other hand, Admiral Chester Nimitz, directing the Central Pacific Drive, pushed for a more direct strike at Taiwan and Okinawa. Skipping the Philippines, he argued, would save lives and shorten the path toward the Japanese homeland. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally intervened in this debate. During a meeting in Hawaii, he heard both sides and ultimately chose to back MacArthur's plan. The Philippines would be retaken, and to secure that invasion, a small but heavily defended island group in the Palau chain, Peleliu and Angkor, would need to be seized first. Control of these islands would protect the flank of MacArthur's forces and provide additional airfields to support the advance. Yet even as the plan was finalized, doubts rippled through the American High Command. Admiral William Bull Halsey, a man not known for caution, strongly recommended skipping Peleliu altogether. His intelligence officers reported that Japanese air power in the region had already been decimated, and the island's airfield might not be critical to the Philippines campaign. Why waste Marines on a coral rock, he warned, but his advice was dismissed. The operation was scheduled, the landing forces already assigned. The Marines would go in regardless. The seeds of tragedy were planted before a single shot was fired. What was expected to be a 3-day operation would instead descend into a 2-month bloodbath. By ignoring the warning signs and underestimating the Japanese defenders, U.S. commanders set the stage for casualty rates that would climb to staggering levels. Units shredded until nearly 78% of their men were killed or wounded. While the Americans debated strategy, the Japanese prepared Peleliu to become a death trap. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the island's garrison, had carefully studied Japan's earlier defeats at places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. The old doctrine of meeting the enemy at the beaches with suicidal banzai charges had proven catastrophic. Each time, waves of Japanese soldiers were cut down by naval gunfire and overwhelming U.S. firepower. Nakagawa knew that repeating those mistakes would only ensure another rapid defeat. Instead, he adopted a new philosophy: defense in depth. Rather than throwing his men away in futile counterattacks, Nakagawa ordered his 11,000 soldiers to dig in and make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. Peleliu's natural geography made this plan brutally effective. The island's Umurbrogol Ridge was a maze of limestone outcroppings, jagged cliffs, and dense jungle. Nakagawa's engineers transformed it into a fortress. Hundreds of caves, many already carved by nature, were reinforced with concrete and steel. They were linked together by an extensive tunnel system that allowed defenders to move unseen from one position to another. Heavy artillery, mortars, and machine guns were placed inside these hidden strongholds, their barrels poking out from narrow firing slits that made them almost invulnerable to bombardment. If one bunker came under attack, its neighbors could cover it with overlapping fields of fire. The defenders could vanish into the mountain, then reappear in an unexpected spot hours later. Even the beaches were carefully prepared. Though Nakagawa no longer intended to hold the shoreline at all costs, he left behind small groups of soldiers supported by mines, preset artillery shells, and camouflaged bunkers. Their task was to slow the initial landing, inflict casualties, and then withdraw into the ridges where the real fight would begin. This was no longer a fight about honor through death charges. It was calculated attrition. Nakagawa's men were told to survive as long as possible, to drag out the battle and bleed the Americans until they questioned whether the island was worth the cost. Each soldier was expected to kill 10 Americans before being killed himself. By September 1944, Peleliu had become one of the most formidable defensive positions in the Pacific. Unknown to the Marines preparing to land, they were about to face a new kind of war, one that turned caves into fortresses, ridges into killing grounds, and a tiny island into a nightmare. Casualty rates would skyrocket, and the prediction of a 3-day battle would soon seem like the cruelest joke of the war. At dawn on September 15, 1944, the first waves of Marines braced inside their landing craft as naval guns thundered behind them. For 3 days, battleships and aircraft had rained shells and bombs onto Peleliu. Columns of smoke still curled above the ridges, giving the impression that little could have survived. Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, remained confident. He had told his men the island would fall in just 3 or 4 days. The Marines believed they were about to mop up scattered resistance, but as the first amphibious tractors crunched onto the coral sand, the island came alive. Hidden steel doors swung open along the ridges, and from the black mouths of caves poured an inferno of fire. Heavy machine guns stitched the beach with deadly accuracy. 47mm anti-tank cannons pounded the LVTS, setting them ablaze and spilling men into waist-deep water already boiling with shrapnel. In minutes, 60 landing vehicles were destroyed, their wreckage choking the shoreline. On the northern flank, Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's 1st Marines were pinned by fire from a rocky headland, later called the Point. Shells smashed command posts, cutting communications and leaving frontline companies blind. In the south, the 7th Marines faced a wall of bullets so thick that men leapt into the surf, wading ashore through chest-high water while machine gun tracers skipped across the waves. Many never made it to dry land. Only the 5th Marines in the center pushed forward, reaching the airfield by midday. But there, Colonel Nakagawa unleashed his sole armored counterattack, light tanks rolling across the runway with infantry close behind. It looked for a moment like the Americans might be driven back into the sea. Then the U.S. Shermans came forward, their 75mm guns roaring. Naval guns offshore and dive bombers overhead joined in. And within minutes, the Japanese armor was reduced to burning wrecks scattered across the field. By nightfall, the Marines had secured a tenuous foothold, 3 kilometers wide and a mile deep in the center. Yet the cost was staggering: 200 dead and nearly 1,000 wounded in a single day. Peleliu, predicted to be quick and easy, had revealed itself as a trap, a battlefield where every cave concealed death and every ridge rained fire. In the days that followed, the fighting only grew more savage. Nowhere was this more evident than at the Point, a jagged outcrop dominating the landing beaches. Whoever held it could pour fire into the Marines below. To silence it, Captain George Hunt and Company K of the 1st Marines were ordered forward on September 16th. 200 men scrambled over the rocks at dawn, expecting to seize a single bunker. Instead, they found themselves inside a hornet's nest. With mortars lost during the landing and few heavy weapons at hand, the Marines had little more than rifle, grenades, and sheer determination. One by one, they stormed pillboxes, using smoke to blind defenders, then grenades to finish the fight. In this way, Hunt's company knocked out half a dozen machine gun nests before finally silencing a 47mm gun with with a desperate close-range assault. By noon, against all odds, they held the point. But Nakagawa understood its importance. For 30 hours, he hurled wave after wave of counterattacks at the exhausted Marines. Ammunition ran low. Water was gone. Men fought hand-to-hand in the dark, swinging rifles like clubs, stabbing with bayonets, even hurling rocks when bullets failed. One Marine later recalled, "It was like fighting demons in the night." By dawn, only 18 of Hunt's original 235 men were unhurt. 75% were dead or wounded. Yet they had held, and the point was finally secured. Elsewhere, the 1st Marines faced the nightmare of the Umurbrogol ridges. Every advance into the limestone heights was met by crossfire from interlocking bunkers. Medics and stretcher-bearers were deliberately targeted by Japanese snipers, forcing Marines to risk their lives even to evacuate the wounded. At night, infiltrators crept into foxholes, slitting throats or tossing grenades before vanishing back into the tunnels. Sleep became impossible. Marines dug two-man positions so one could watch while the other dozed. For Puller's regiment, Peleliu was becoming a death sentence. Entire companies were whittled down to shadows of their former strength. By early October, the 1st Marines would suffer casualties so high, nearly 60%, that the regiment was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. By late September, the Marines had secured the airfield and southern half of the island. But the real test lay in the north. The jagged limestone ridges of the Umurbrogol, quickly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. To advance meant climbing into a maze of caves and bunkers carved deep into the rock. From these hidden lairs, Colonel Nakagawa's soldiers fired machine guns, mortars, and artillery with deadly precision, making every approach a killing ground. The Marines soon discovered the futility of frontal assaults. Whenever they stormed one cave, fire erupted from 2 more on the flanks. The Japanese had designed the ridge as a fortress, where every position supported the next. One after another, platoons were chewed apart for gains measured in yards. Medics became primary targets. Snipers deliberately picked them off, knowing that every wounded man required several more to carry him back. At night, infiltrators slipped through the lines, tossing grenades into foxholes or bayoneting men in their sleep. Amid this slaughter, Captain Everett Pope led his company up what he believed was Hill 100. After a full day of climbing under fire, his men dug in on a rocky outcrop, only to realize they were beneath an even higher summit, bristling with enemy guns. Reinforcements never came. Through the night, Pope's Marines endured wave after wave of counterattacks. When ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, even rocks torn from the ridge itself. By dawn, only 9 Marines remained standing. Pope would later receive the Medal of Honor, but his company was effectively destroyed. This was Peleliu's true horror. Not grand maneuvers or sweeping offensives, but grinding attrition in sweltering heat where every cave had to be blasted with flamethrowers, grenades, or satchel charges. By early October, the 1st Marine Regiment had been bled dry, losing over 60% of its strength. The proud regiment was no longer combat effective, yet Nakagawa's fortress still held. The devastation forced General Roy Geiger to call in reserves. On September 23rd, the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, landed to relieve the battered Marines, fresh and untested in combat. They quickly realized Peleliu was no ordinary battlefield. The Wildcats' mission was to strike into the rear of the Umurbrogol and link up with the exhausted Marines. But the moment they advanced into the ridges, they too were swallowed by the nightmare. Japanese fire poured from hidden gun ports. Mortar shells rained down from unseen positions. Every ravine was a trap, every slope covered by interlocking fire. In one valley, later named Death Valley, entire companies were cut down trying to cross open ground. The limestone terrain was so jagged that tanks often became useless, trapped on coral ledges, or picked off by concealed artillery. Engineers struggled to keep up, blasting cave entrances with demolitions, only to watch new firing points open up yards away. The Wildcats fought with determination, determination, but they suffered terribly. Within weeks, nearly half of the 5th and 7th Marines had been lost, and now the 81st Division began to see its own casualty lists grow. Still, unlike the Marines, they could rotate fresh battalions into the line, slowly grinding down the defenders. Their task was made easier by the arrival of Marine Corsair fighter bombers operating directly from Peleliu's airfield. Rockets and napalm seared the ridges, collapsing caves or burning out the defenders within. Even so, the Japanese showed no signs of breaking. Colonel Nakagawa had ordered his men to fight to the last, and they obeyed. Bunkers had to be reduced one by one, with satchel charges hurled into firing ports and flamethrowers blasting until nothing moved. By mid-October, the Wildcats had taken over the fight entirely, as the shattered Marines were withdrawn. Yet the battle still dragged on, turning into one of the most drawn-out and costly island fights of the entire Pacific War. By mid-October 1944, Peleliu had become a charnel house. The Japanese defenders had fought with fanatical tenacity, but their fortress was slowly crumbling under relentless pressure. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, napalm, and artillery strikes gradually chewed away at their interconnected cave system. Yet even as the battlefield shrank, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa refused to surrender. His men, drilled in the doctrine of fighting to the death, clung to every position until annihilation. The U.S. Army's 81st Division now bore the full burden of the campaign. Unlike the Marines, they had reserves to cycle fresh battalions into the ridges, but progress was measured in feet, not miles. Engineers blasted one cave after another, but every victory seemed to trigger another ambush from the next ridge. The jagged terrain made casualty evacuation a nightmare. Wounded soldiers often lay exposed for hours under sniper fire before stretcher teams could reach them. Many survivors later recalled the eerie cries echoing at night, Japanese defenders taunting the Americans or shouting false commands in English to sow confusion. Inside the caves, Japanese soldiers lived like ghosts. With supplies dwindling, they rationed water by licking condensation from cave walls. Ammunition was hoarded for close-range ambushes. Some defenders emerged only at night to scavenge American rations from the dead, disappearing back into the labyrinth before dawn. Despite starvation, they fought with lethal effectiveness until the very end. Colonel Nakagawa embodied this grim defiance. Even as his command shrank from thousands to hundreds, he kept transmitting reports to Tokyo. His final messages were symbolic, acknowledging that the regiment's weapons were destroyed and their flag burned to prevent capture. Facing inevitable defeat, he and his remaining officers carried out ritual suicide, leaving their men to fight on until they too fell. By late November, only scattered holdouts remained, hunted down one by one in the ridges. The sheer cost was staggering. Of the 11,000 Japanese defenders, over 10,900 were killed. Barely 200 survived, most of them non-combatants or laborers. For the U.S., the butcher's bill was equally grim. More than 10,000 Marines and soldiers killed or wounded. One regiment of Marines had lost nearly 70% of its strength, making Peleliu one of the bloodiest battles in the entire Pacific theater. When Peleliu was finally declared secure on November 27, 1944, American commanders faced a sobering truth. The island had cost thousands of lives, but contributed little to the larger war effort. General MacArthur's push into the Philippines went ahead regardless of Peleliu's capture, and the airfield that had been the supposed prize was scarcely used. In hindsight, Admiral William Halsey's warnings that the operation was unnecessary seemed prophetic. Thousands had been sacrificed for ground that was strategically irrelevant. For the Marines who fought there, Peleliu left scars that never healed. Survivors spoke of it not as a battle, but as an ordeal. Weeks of hell under crushing heat, thirst, and constant fear. Temperatures soared past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and many men collapsed from heat stroke as often as from enemy fire. Supplies of drinkable water remained tainted with oil for days, forcing soldiers to risk dehydration. rather than drink foul liquid. The island itself became an enemy, its jagged coral cutting through boots and skin, its ridges concealing death at every turn. News of the battle barely reached the American public at the time. Overshadowed by MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines and the massive European offensives, Peleliu became the forgotten battle. Only years later, through veterans' memoirs and historians' work, did its brutality come to light. Marines who fought there often described it as the harshest fight of the Pacific, worse even than Tarawa or Iwo Jima, because the sacrifice seemed wasted. Strategically, Peleliu served as a grim lesson. The Japanese had perfected their new defense-in-depth strategy, abandoning suicidal beach charges in favor of hidden fortresses designed to bleed attackers dry. The same tactics would later appear at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but by then, American commanders understood the horrific costs such strongholds demanded. Peleliu was their first warning, and it was written in blood. For Japan, the battle showcased both their soldiers' ferocity and their leadership's blindness. The garrison had been ordered to die to the last man, even though the island was already irrelevant to the broader war. The defenders' sacrifice delayed the Americans only briefly, yet it annihilated an entire division of Japan's best-trained troops. In the end, Peleliu stood as a monument to wasted lives, an island drenched in blood where 78% of soldiers died for nothing more than pride and flawed strategy.